$38 trillion. That's not a problem waiting to be solved. It's a reality that's already been accepted, a number so extreme that every traditional solution collapses under its own weight the moment it's applied. When debt reaches this scale, choices disappear. And yet, life goes on. Markets open, governments borrow more, headlines move on, because most people believe there's still a debate happening that someone, somewhere, is working on a plan to fix it. There isn't. Not through taxes, not through spending cuts, not through growth. Those were options once. They stopped being options years ago when the math crossed a point of no return. What remains is management. A quiet shift from repayment to reduction, from solving the problem to dissolving it over time. No crisis, no announcement, just a system adjusting itself in ways most people never notice. Because while public attention stays focused on what should happen, the real work is already underway. A strategy designed not to confront the debt, but to quietly erase its weight. And once you realize the decision is already made, the only question left is how. For decades, we've been told the same story. That somehow, eventually, this will all balance out. That higher taxes will fill the gap. That smarter spending will fix the problem. That innovation and growth will carry us out of the hole, the way it always has before. But none of that survives contact with the numbers. Raising taxes at the scale required would collapse consumption and slow the economy before it ever touched the debt. Cutting spending sounds responsible until you realize most of the budget isn't optional. It's already locked into defense, healthcare, and interest payments. And economic growth? Even optimistic projections don't come close to outpacing the speed at which the debt compounds. This isn't pessimism, it's arithmetic. The uncomfortable reality is that every traditional solution people argue about on television has already failed, not emotionally, not politically, but mathematically. The outcome was decided long before the debate began, which leaves only one question that almost no one is asking. So, if none of this works, what are they actually doing? There's a reason most people have never heard the term. It doesn't sound dangerous, it doesn't sound aggressive, it doesn't even sound intentional. In fact, it sounds like something pulled from a dry economics textbook and forgotten on a shelf. Financial repression. Two ordinary words, carefully chosen, because the most powerful tools are always hidden behind the dullest language. Financial repression is not a crisis response. It's not an emergency lever. It's a long-term strategy. A set of policies designed to quietly tilt the financial system in one direction away from savers and toward debtors, not through force, not through announcements, but through rules, incentives, and slow erosion. It doesn't take your money outright. It doesn't send you a bill. It simply changes the conditions so that over time, holding money becomes a losing proposition. And this isn't speculation. It's documented, studied, discussed openly in academic papers and policy briefings. The blueprint exists. The language is technical. The intent is carefully obscured. Because the most effective theft never announces itself. This story didn't begin in the modern era. It didn't start with trillion-dollar deficits, or digital money, or central banks experimenting in real time. It's older than that. Because what's happening now has already happened before, almost step for step. Different decade, different numbers, same problem, same solution. History has a habit of repeating itself when the math becomes unavoidable. The last time the United States faced debt levels this extreme, the situation looked just as hopeless. The obligations were massive. The political options were exhausted. Paying it back in the traditional sense was impossible, and yet, within a generation, the debt largely vanished. No dramatic default, no national bankruptcy, no public reckoning. Most people remember that period as a golden age, a post-war boom, an economic miracle, a time of prosperity and growth. But that story leaves something out. Because when you look past the nostalgia and into the mechanics, a different pattern emerges. A quieter one, a deliberate one. Debt didn't disappear because the system became more virtuous. It disappeared because it was slowly transferred. And the last time this happened, almost no one noticed. In 1945, the United States emerged from World War II as the most powerful nation on earth and the most indebted. Federal debt had exploded to levels never seen before, more than 100% of the country's entire economic output. At the time, economists understood something the public didn't. This debt was mathematically unpayable. Taxes were already high. Wartime spending had ended, but cutting deeper wouldn't come close to solving the problem, and economic growth alone wasn't enough to erase obligations that large. So a different path was chosen. Not loudly, not publicly, but deliberately. The U.S. Treasury and the Federal Reserve began working in coordination. Interest rates on government bonds were capped. Banks were guided and in some cases required to hold government debt. Inflation was allowed to run higher than the returns paid to savers, year after year. On paper, nothing looked radical. There were no headlines about debt liquidation, no emergency declarations. In fact, the era became known for stability and prosperity. But beneath the surface, something precise was happening. The real value of the debt was shrinking, not because it was being paid down, but because time, inflation, and policy were doing the work quietly. The miracle wasn't growth, it was design. Once that system was in place, the mechanics did the rest. Imagine lending money and being told you'll get paid back, but every year the value of what you're owed quietly shrinks, not because someone stole it, not because of fraud, but because the rules were rewritten around you. That's the interest rate trap. When interest rates are pushed below the rate of inflation, something strange happens. On paper, your savings grow. In reality, they decay. You earn interest, but the money buys less every year. You feel responsible for saving, disciplined for planning ahead, and yet you're moving backward. This is what economists call negative real returns. But you don't need the jargon to understand it. It's like running on a treadmill that's slowly speeding up beneath your feet. You're moving, but the ground is moving faster. For governments drowning in debt, this is perfect. The debt still exists, but its weight gets lighter with every passing year. For savers, retirees, and anyone holding cash or bonds, it's invisible erosion. What if saving money is the mistake? For inflation to do its job, it can't arrive like a storm. It has to feel normal, manageable, almost forgettable. That's why the most effective inflation isn't the kind that sparks panic. It's the kind that slips into everyday life quietly. A little more at the grocery store, a little less in your savings account. A slow adjustment you get used to before you ever question it. Inflation doesn't erase the debt, it reshapes it. A government that owes massive sums doesn't need to pay back every dollar if each dollar is worth less tomorrow than it is today. Over time, the obligation shrinks in real terms, even as the number stays the same. Nothing dramatic happens. The debt doesn't vanish from the books. It just becomes easier to carry. This is inflation doing slow, precise work, year after year, compounding quietly in the background, powerful enough to change outcomes, but subtle enough to avoid backlash. And the genius of it is timing. If inflation rises just enough to stay ahead of interest rates, but not enough to cause revolt, the process can run for decades. Nothing disappears. It just becomes smaller. To make this work, perception matters as much as policy. Central banks don't describe what they're doing in blunt terms. They don't talk about eroding debt or transferring wealth. They talk about stability, about liquidity, about keeping markets functioning smoothly. The language is calm, technical, reassuring, and that's the illusion. When a central bank intervenes, it doesn't look like financing government debt. It looks like responsible management. Bond purchases are framed as temporary support. Low rates are presented as tools to help employment. Every action has a justification that sounds neutral, even benevolent, but outcomes don't care about intent. They respond to mechanics. When newly created money is used to buy government bonds, it absorbs debt without forcing the government to find real buyers. When rates stay artificially low, the cost of borrowing remains manageable, not because the market decided it should be, but because the system was designed that way. The words sound responsible. The math tells a different story. Debt doesn't vanish when the numbers get too big. It moves. It shifts quietly from places you can see to places you rarely look, from government balance sheets into private savings, from public obligations into personal purchasing power. When a government borrows at rates below inflation, someone is funding that gap, not through taxes, not through legislation, through lost value. Every dollar saved that earns less than inflation quietly fills part of the whole. Every pension fund holding safe bonds absorbs losses that never appear on a statement. Every insurance pool, every retirement account, every conservative portfolio becomes part of the solution without ever agreeing to it. This is the transfer most people never notice. The government still owes the money. Bondholders still get paid. Nothing breaks. Nothing defaults. But the real cost is carried elsewhere, spread thin across millions of people over long periods of time. Slow enough to feel normal, broad enough to avoid outrage. It's not punishment. It's design. Because someone always pays, the only question is who. Choice is powerful, so the system removes it. Most people assume investors freely decide where their money goes, that markets allocate capital naturally, guided by risk and reward, but that assumption stops holding up once regulations quietly step in. Banks don't just prefer government bonds, they're required to hold them. Pension funds don't simply choose safe assets. They're guided there by rules, incentives, and fiduciary standards that punish deviation. Insurance companies are boxed into similar corners. Even money market funds are structured so that avoiding government debt becomes nearly impossible. This isn't persuasion, it's architecture. The rules don't say, you must finance the government. They say, if you don't, you won't be allowed to operate. Capital flows where it's told, not where it earns the most. Risk is no longer priced by markets alone, it's defined by regulation. Over time, this creates a captive system, a financial cage where trillions of dollars are legally funneled into funding government obligations regardless of return. No announcements, no votes, just compliance. And once the cage is built, the system doesn't need to ask permission anymore. What if the system doesn't allow escape? There's another lever that makes this entire system work faster, and it reaches far beyond U.S. borders. A weaker dollar. When most countries borrow, they face a risk the United States doesn't. Their debt is often tied to foreign currencies. If their currency weakens, their debt becomes harder to repay. But America operates under a different rule set. Almost all of its debt is denominated in its own currency. That changes everything. When the dollar loses value, the nominal debt stays the same, but the real burden shrinks. The government repays yesterday's obligations with today's cheaper dollars. On the surface, nothing looks unusual. Exchange rates move all the time. Markets fluctuate. Analysts debate causes. But underneath, the math is relentless. Every step down in the dollar's value quietly shifts part of the cost outward. Foreign governments, central banks, and institutions holding U.S. debt absorb losses in their own currency terms. The burden doesn't disappear, it's exported. And that creates a strange paradox. The weaker the dollar gets, the lighter the debt feels. The system breathes easier. Pressure releases. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Is currency weakness a symptom or a tool? There's a final illusion that makes all of this appear successful, even healthy. It shows up in charts, in reports, in official projections that say things are improving. Debt is still large, but suddenly it looks more manageable, safer, under control. That illusion lives in a ratio, debt to GDP. When people hear that number falling, they assume debt is being reduced. But that's not what the math actually says, because the ratio doesn't care how it improves, only that it does. If the economy grows faster than the debt, the ratio shrinks. But here's the part almost no one talks about. Growth doesn't have to be real, it just has to be nominal. Inflation counts. Price increases count. Everything becoming more expensive counts. If GDP rises because goods cost more, the denominator grows even if living standards don't. The debt hasn't gone down. The fraction just looks better on paper. And that's enough to reassure markets, calm politicians, and sell the story that progress is being made. What if improvement is just arithmetic? By this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because once you understand how the system works, the outcomes stop looking random. Some people win. Anyone with large, fixed debt benefits when money loses value. Borrowers watch the real weight of what they owe shrink year after year. Monthly payments stay the same, but incomes slowly rise with inflation. The debt doesn't disappear, it becomes easier to live with. Governments sit at the very top of that list. As the largest debtor of all, every percentage point of inflation quietly works in their favor. But someone has to absorb the other side. Savers do. Retirees do. People who did everything right, worked, saved, avoided risk, find themselves running in place. Their money earns interest, but not enough to keep up. Pensions stretch thinner, fixed incomes lose purchasing power, years of planning are eroded without a single law ever being passed against them. This is where the story turns personal. The system doesn't punish recklessness, it penalizes patience. It doesn't reward restraint, it rewards leverage. And once you see who benefits and who pays, the design becomes clear. The system doesn't hurt everyone equally. If this were happening openly, it would be impossible to maintain. People would resist, headlines would scream, politicians would be forced to explain themselves. But that's exactly why the strategy depends on something else entirely. Invisibility. Most people don't feel robbed, they feel squeezed. They notice prices creeping up, savings not stretching as far, their paycheck doing a little less each year. But they don't connect those feelings to policy. They blame supply chains, corporations, greed, bad luck. The system relies on that confusion. There's no single moment to point to, no bill in the mail, no announcement that says, your purchasing power has been reduced to pay down government debt. The cost is spread thin, across millions of transactions, over long periods of time. Too gradual to trigger revolt, too complex to trace. And because the cause stays hidden, so does the anger. You don't fight what you can't see. What makes this possible isn't just domestic policy, it's coordination. The United States isn't acting alone. Other major economies face the same problem, massive debt levels that can't be repaid without destabilizing their societies. And over time, they've converged on remarkably similar solutions. In Japan, interest rates have been held near zero for decades. Government bonds are purchased directly and indirectly to cap borrowing costs. In Europe, central banks have done the same, suppressing yields while expanding their balance sheets in the name of stability. Different languages, different institutions, same mechanics. This matters because financial repression works best when no single country stands out. If only one nation weakens its currency or suppresses rates, markets react violently. Capital flees, confidence breaks. But when multiple major economies move together, the pressure diffuses. Exchange rates shift slowly. The system stays intact. It only works if everyone plays along. And that coordination creates the illusion of normalcy, a global environment where nothing seems broken, even as value is quietly extracted everywhere at once. For all its precision, this system has a limit. It depends on trust. Inflation has to stay high enough to reduce the real burden of debt, but low enough that people tolerate it. Interest rates must remain suppressed, but not so obviously that markets panic. Currency weakness has to feel like fluctuation, not collapse. Every lever must move, but never too fast. Because once confidence breaks, the entire strategy unravels. If people stop believing their money will hold value, they stop behaving normally. They rush to spend. They hoard real assets. They abandon the rules the system depends on. Inflation accelerates beyond control, not because policy changed, but because belief did. That's the risk no central bank can fully manage. Push too hard, and inflation runs away. Move too slowly, and the debt never shrinks enough. Raise rates, and interest costs explode. Keep them low, and credibility erodes. There is no safe setting, only constant adjustment. Every system breaks if pushed too far. The question isn't whether this strategy works. History proves that it does. The question is whether it can be maintained long enough to finish the job before trust runs out. If you follow the pattern, the next phase is already visible. Not in headlines, in trajectories. Historically, when governments rely on this strategy, the timeline isn't measured in months or election cycles. It's measured in decades, slow enough that it feels permanent. Fast enough that, by the time the outcome is obvious, it's already locked in. Over the next 10 years, nothing dramatic needs to happen. No crisis, no reset, no announcement. Inflation doesn't have to explode. Interest rates don't have to collapse. The system only needs to keep doing what it's doing now, just consistently. As prices rise, nominal GDP grows. As GDP grows, debt to GDP ratios fall. The debt still exists on paper, but it carries less weight every year. Governments refinance old obligations with cheaper money. Savers absorb small losses repeatedly, barely noticing any single one. By the mid-2030s, the narrative will be clear. The debt problem improved. Not solved, not paid back, just smaller. And by the time most people recognize what actually happened, the window to react will already be closed. By the time it's obvious, it's finished. This is not collapse. That's the misunderstanding that keeps people waiting for the wrong signal. There won't be a single breaking point, no moment where everything snaps and the truth is revealed all at once. What's happening is slower than that and far more effective. It's controlled erosion, a deliberate process where obligations don't vanish, but their weight is transferred. Where the system stays intact, markets keep functioning, and everyday life continues, just a little more expensive each year, enough to matter, not enough to revolt. The danger isn't panic, it's acceptance. Because once people accept that money permanently buys less, that saving no longer protects them, that planning ahead doesn't work the way it used to, the strategy has already succeeded. The cost has been paid, just not by the institutions that created the problem. Awareness is the only remaining advantage. Understanding the pattern doesn't stop it, but it changes how you move inside it. And that difference matters more than most people realize. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. If you want to understand how this affects you personally and what people historically did to protect themselves, stay with this channel.